A strange man suddenly stops his car to offer a mother and her child a lift because her car is faulty. But because it's really dark, the woman doesn't look sure about it, but she eventually accepts. After she enters the car, though, the man locks the doors and tells her that after he kills her, he'll throw her baby away. A few months earlier, a lady named Darlene and her lover Mike are talking inside their car when a man suddenly shows up and shoots them. Following this, the killer then calls the police to report the crime, but when they get there, they only meet Mike alive, still struggling for his life. A while later, a cartoonist at the San Francisco Chronicle named Robert arrives at work and immediately has to submit some cartoons to the editor Templeton during a staff meeting. Shortly after, Templeton's secretary gives him a letter, which turns out to be from an anonymous sender who claims responsibility for the death of Darlene, as well as the shooting of another couple. In addition to the letter, the person attached a cipher, which he wants to get published on the front page. He mentions that if his demands aren't met, he'll go on a killing spree. This letter shocks everyone at the office, and they start wondering what to do. A senior writer at the paper, Paul, calls the police to confirm the information about the victims mentioned in the letter. He then finds out that the killer's account of the events is real. After the senior officials at the paper then decide to print it on page 4, Paul says he's willing to place a bet that the killer's name is in the code. However, Robert interrupts and says the killer won't give his name. Hours after the cipher gets published, a history teacher named Betty cracks the code after seeing it in the newspaper. When the results arrive at the Chronicle, Paul goes to Robert to ask how he knew the killer wouldn't mention his name. Robert doesn't answer this and just starts reading the cracked code, where the killer talks about how he enjoys killing people as a sport. Robert also seems mostly intrigued by the fact that the killer called humans the most dangerous animal in the world. Robert realizes that he has seen that quote before, but he can't remember where. Just then, the Chronicle receives another letter in which the killer refers to himself as the Zodiac and uses a symbol as his signature. About a month later, a man and his wife are enjoying their vacation in a public park when a strange man wearing a disguise appears and stabs them to death. After a while, he then calls the police to report it. The next day at work, Robert remembers where he saw the Zodiac's quote about humans being a dangerous animal. He says it's from a movie called The Most Dangerous Game. He also explains that in the movie, the main character kills people for sport. Days later, the Zodiac kills a cab driver named Stein in a different part of the city. A group of kids from a nearby house see this and report it to the police, though they mention that it's a robbery. A detective named Dave is immediately called in to check the crime scene. As he gets there with his partner William, they discover that the killer left his gloves inside the cab. Following this, they decide to interview the kids who called in. From the interview, Dave learns that the killer came to the driver's side and wiped something off the door before leaving. The following day, Templeton's secretary gets another letter, which comes with a bloodstained piece of cloth. As they read the letter, the Zodiac takes responsibility for Stein's murder. He also adds that he'd love to wipe out a school bus to kill some kids. Dave and William arrive at the Chronicle to hear what the letter says. They are left shocked by this, but before they leave, Dave tells Paul not to write any story about the threat to kids. Dave then meets with a handwriting specialist who confirms that the Zodiac sent the letter. Following this, he gives the all clear for it to be announced on the news. The next day at work, Robert still seems obsessed about the case, and he tells Paul that he thinks the Zodiac killed Stein to break his pattern of killing couples. Elsewhere, William eventually gets to speak to the captains in the other locations where the Zodiac has killed people. From his investigation, he then finds out that the footprints from Darlene's murder scene shows that the shoe belongs to someone who has been in the military. William also asks about Mike, but he's told that the survivor has left the town. That night, Dave gets a call informing him that the Zodiac has called again. This time, the serial killer says he wants to speak to a talk show host named Melvin. Dave and William then pick up Melvin from his house, and as they train him on what to say, they mention that Melvin has to convince the Zodiac to meet. A while later, the Zodiac calls in on the show, and Melvin asks if he can give a name, so he says he's Sam. As Melvin then asks if he needs help, the Zodiac says he's always having headaches that never go away. Melvin then suggests getting the Zodiac to meet his chiropractor, but he hangs up. Dave realizes that the Zodiac probably knew they were tracing his call, so Melvin mentions on the show that the call is not being traced. Following this, the Zodiac calls again and mentions that he kills people because it stops his headaches. Melvin then asks if he'd like to meet up, and he agrees, though he picks the place. The next day, the Zodiac doesn't show up, and after getting someone to analyze the voices from the 2 calls that came in, the cops realize that the second call was a prank call from a mental institution. A week later, the Zodiac sends another letter mentioning that he'll stop announcing his murders. He also adds that he's building a bomb that will be stored in his basement for future use. This leaves William and Dave stuck on what to do because there are very few basements in the area. That night, Paul and Robert hang out at a bar to discuss the new Zodiac letter. Just then, Paul asks Robert why he's really interested in the case, and he says it's because he likes codes. A week later, Melvin gets a letter from the Zodiac asking for help because he's thinking of going on a murder spree. While speaking to Dave and William, Melvin also mentions that the Zodiac has tried calling his house several times, but his maid always tells him that her boss is not around. A few weeks later, the Zodiac resurfaces when he offers to give a woman and her baby a lift after her car develops a fault. The woman agrees, but when she enters the car, the killer threatens to kill the woman and throw her baby out of the window. Luckily, she jumps out of the car before he does anything. In the weeks that follow, the Zodiac sends several letters confirming that tried to kill the woman. He also takes responsibility for a couple of other murders. However, the Chronicle stops writing about his letters again. While Paul is talking to Robert about it, he mentions that it's a good strategy because there's a chance the Zodiac hasn't killed anyone since Stein. Paul also proves to Robert that, unlike before, the Zodiac now sends his letters after the stories have made the news. He also shows Paul that the Zodiac probably got his name from a watch company with the same name and symbol. After months of silence from the Zodiac, Paul finally receives a letter from the serial killer attached to a piece of Stein's bloodstained shirt. He immediately gets furious because he's now a target, and while he speaks to the cops, Dave says it's likely because Paul insulted the Zodiac in one of his stories. Paul then asks for a gun so he can protect himself. He eventually gets one, and while he's at the shooting range, he tells Robert that he has a meeting in Riverside with an anonymous person who might have something on the Zodiac. He asks Robert to follow him, but he rejects the offer because he has a date with a lady named Melanie. Shortly after, Robert arrives late for the date, but he explains himself to Melanie and says he was with Paul. She then asks where Paul is, so Robert tells her. However, she thinks Paul might be going into a trap since the anonymous person might be the Zodiac. Robert immediately gets nervous and calls Paul's wife to confirm if he has called. Unfortunately, she says Paul hasn't called yet, so Robert and Melanie head home to wait for his call. When it eventually comes, Paul tells Robert that he has made a shocking discovery. He then goes on the news to report a murder in Riverside that the Zodiac might also be responsible for. Dave and William are shocked to hear this on the news because he didn't tell them first. Following this, Dave and some other detectives head to Riverside to get details on the murder, which could be the first Zodiac killing. Shortly after, they find out that the Riverside killer also sent a letter to confess the crime. Days later, Dave and William receive a tip from a man named Cheney, who claims to know the Zodiac. According to the man, his old buddy, Lee, talked about how he would go on a killing spree and send letters to the police while calling himself the Zodiac. Cheney adds that when he complained about the name, Lee got angry and said he'd still go ahead with his plan. Cheney also mentions that he reported to the police when the first Zodiac murder started, but the cops dismissed him because they thought he was lying. Following this, William and Dave get clearance to find Lee and ask him questions. When they finally meet him along with a sergeant named Mulanax, Lee denies ever mentioning anything about the Zodiac to anyone. He also mentions that a cop interrogated him after the first Zodiac murder. He adds that it's likely because his neighbor saw him with bloody knives and said something to the police. Lee eventually mentions that his neighbor died of a heart attack about a week later. As he keeps talking, the cops identify Lee's shoes as military grade, which is because he used to be in the Navy. They also see that he's wearing a Zodiac watch, though he says he got it as a birthday present from his mom some months ago. Seeing as the questions are becoming too many, Lee says he's not the Zodiac, though he adds that he wouldn't tell them even if he was. As the cops then ask if still he doesn't remember talking about the Zodiac, Lee suddenly mentions that he only told a guy named Phil that his favorite book is The Most Dangerous Game. After they allow Lee to return to work, Dave believes he's the closest suspect to being the Zodiac. Hours later, they find his brother, who says Lee has always had mental issues. His sister-in-law also notices that the Zodiac spelled Christmas in his letters like Lee once spelled it in a note to them. Following this, Dave and William try to get a warrant to search Lee's house, but they don't get it because they don't have enough evidence. After a year, Dave eventually gets a warrant after finding out that Lee now stays in a trailer. Shortly after, William and Dave find his trailer while he's not around. Inside, they find 3 guns as well as a pair of gloves and shoes that match the ones they have of the Zodiac. Lee soon arrives and sees them, but he says nothing. Days later, Dave and William are left disappointed when their captain informs them that none of the things they found, including Lee's handwriting, matches the Zodiac's own. 4 years later, while coming across some old papers about the Zodiac, Robert thinks it would be nice for someone to write a book about the serial killer. He then pitches the idea to Paul, but he says he's not interested, especially now that he has lost his job for writing a letter to the police asking to be put in charge of the investigation. Robert then leaves and starts doing his research at the library. Days later, he meets with Dave and asks for his help with details on the case, but the detective dismisses him because the case has gone stale since they've not received a letter from the Zodiac in 3 years. However, he eventually tells Robert to find someone named Ken. When he meets Ken, Robert is directed to Mullinax so he can look through the case files of Darlene's murder. After a while, he finds another lead and meets Dave again. He then mentions that based on the case files, Darlene had an admirer who attended a painting party at her house and got her scared. He adds that before Darlene's family heard about her death, someone called her brother-in-law and father-in-law, but they only heard heavy breathing. With this, they determined that the killer likely knew Darlene. Since Michael is still nowhere to be found, Robert says he can find Darlene's sister, Linda. He then asks Dave for help, and the detective tells him about the maid who got to speak to the Zodiac at Melvin's house. Robert immediately goes there, and while waiting for Melvin, his maid realizes that he's there to ask about the Zodiac, so she mentions that she spoke to the serial killer once. Robert asks what he said, and the maid says he just talked about needing to kill someone because it was his birthday. Robert then uses this to pinpoint the date of the Zodiac's birthday as December 18th. He goes to inform Dave about this, and the detective directs him to meet someone named Mel to see if anything was found regarding the maid's conversation with the Zodiac. Robert immediately follows Dave's instructions, but Mel says the birthday probably means nothing. However, Robert believes it might be the only time the Zodiac slipped up. Mel doesn't believe this, but he says that no suspect was born on December 18th. He then tells Robert to focus on the pieces of evidence found. Following this, Robert decides to book an appointment with Sherwood to ask about the handwriting samples. When he gets home, Melanie tells him that Sherwood is called back. He sounds happy about this, but Melanie looks pissed because Robert's research on the Zodiac has been reported in the newspaper. Robert doesn't see a problem in it, but Melanie says it might lead the Zodiac to them. Just as he tries to explain himself, someone calls the house phone. Robert picks it up, and it turns out to be an anonymous caller who says he knows who the Zodiac is. He tells Robert to find someone named Bob because he's the Zodiac's friend who is keeping some film canisters containing evidence that he was asked to never open. The caller also tells Robert that the Zodiac is a man named Rick. The next day, Robert meets Sherwood, who says none of the handwritings he evaluated matched the Zodiac's. He eventually mentions that someone named Penny visited him a while ago and told him that the Zodiac is Rick. This leaves Robert shocked because someone also told him the same thing. Sherwood then says he never cleared anyone named Rick. When Robert gets home, he gets a random call, but he only hears the person breathing, and this leaves him scared. Following this, Robert visits Ken to ask about Rick. Ken then says that Rick was his favorite suspect in the case because the day he gave him a photo to look at, he was more concerned about cleaning his prints. Ken then suggests getting Rick's handwriting to see if it matches the Zodiac's. Robert then gets Penny's number from Sherwood to ask for Rick's handwriting samples. Penny initially refuses to give anything, but he later agrees to send a poster Rick used to write while he worked at a theater. When he finally gets the poster, Sherwood checks it and asks for more samples because it's the closest match he has had to look at. A while later, Dave gets a call that a new letter from the Zodiac has arrived with his name in it. As he gets to the precinct, though, he is called in for questioning because they believe he forged the letter to gain some public attention. The next day, Robert meets Dave to ask for help to find Linda because he and Sherwood might have a handwriting match. Aside from telling Robert that Sherwood is now a drunkard who was fired from his job, Dave tells him never to bother him about the case anymore, especially because of how hard he worked to prove that he didn't forge the new letter. The next day, Robert starts working with Ken to find Linda. After a while, Robert finally finds out that Linda is in jail. Melanie sees his excitement and asks what he hopes to gain from the case. He says he just wants to find the killer, but Melanie seems bothered because someone has been calling their house every night. However, Robert says it's nothing and that he needs to visit Bob. Shortly after, Robert meets Bob near a restaurant, but the man suggests going to his house. Robert agrees, and when they arrive, he asks about Rick. Bob asks if it has anything to do with the canisters because Rick eventually came to get them. As Robert then asks for most posters Rick wrote, Bob says he was the one who always wrote them. This gets him scared, and Bob also gets creepy when he tells Robert to follow him to his basement. While they're there, Robert eventually gets really scared and leaves. He then returns home only to discover that Melanie has taken the kids away. The next day, he then meets with Linda in prison. He asks about Darlene's weird friend who came to the painting party. Linda says Darlene was always scared of the person and that she even warned people to stay away from him. Robert asks if she remembers the name, and as she thinks about it for a while, Linda says it's Lee. Robert immediately runs to Mullinax to check one of the case files again. Following this, he confirms that Linda mentioned Lee in a past statement, but Mullinax says it means nothing because the suspect was cleared. Robert then leaves looking disappointed. When he gets home, he receives a call from someone who only breathes heavily, so he ends the call. Shortly after, Melanie comes in to see him. She says she's unhappy with how obsessed he is, but he says he just wants to finish the case. She then drops an envelope for him and tells him to finish it so that she and the kids can come home. After she leaves, he opens the envelope and sees a copy of Lee's ID, which shows that he was born on December 18th. Almost immediately, he heads out to Dave's house in the middle of the night. Dave initially threatens to call the police, but as Robert mentions Lee, he opens the door. Robert then shows Dave the ID and says the Zodiac has to be Lee. After a while, Dave says that Lee was the only suspect who got back to him. He mentions that Lee sent him a typed letter offering to help so that the Zodiac can be found. Dave then mentions that before that, Lee had been in jail for a few years, which coincided with when the letters stopped. They eventually moved somewhere else in the morning, and there, Robert mentions that everything he found points to Lee. Dave says there might be other Lees, but Robert tells him that he recently discovered that Lee lived in his grandmother's basement, just a few miles from where Darlene worked. Following this, Dave realizes that Lee knew Darlene. He then tells Robert to finish the book he's writing. He also thanks Robert for helping him finally clear his mind of who the Zodiac could be. A while later, Robert goes to a store where Lee is working. As he sees Lee, he only stares at him and says nothing. Lee also sees him, but as he recognizes Robert, he gets nervous. However, Robert just leaves. 7.5 years later, Mike finally comes out of hiding, so a detective named George sets up a meeting with him. As he then walks to the meeting, there are several copies of Robert's book on sale as a bestseller. When Mike finally meets George, the detective shows Mike pictures of suspects in the case, after which he's asked to identify the person who shot him. As Mike looks closer, he points at Lee and says he's the shooter. George then asks him to confirm this on a scale of 1 to 10, and Mike picks 8.